January 20th, 2018, 7 men arrived in Switzerland's Muatathal Valley for a guided expedition into Holach. They were between 25 and 55 years old and came from German-speaking Switzerland. None planned to spend more than one night underground. Their guide, however, knew that the cave could change quickly when water entered its lower passages. Holach is one of Europe's largest cave systems. Its mapped tunnels extend for more than 200 kilometers beneath the limestone mountains of the canton of Schwyz. The system contains long galleries, vertical shafts, underground streams, and sections that become completely impassable during flooding. Winter is normally the safest season for deeper expeditions, because much of the mountain's water remains locked in snow. The group's 2-day trip had therefore been scheduled for January, when the cave streams were expected to stay low. The weather forecast presented a complication. Snow had been expected at higher elevations, but temperatures rose and rain began falling instead. Water that might otherwise have remained frozen flowed across the mountain and entered the cave system. The danger was established. In 1952, an exploration team had been cut off inside Holach for 10 days after water blocked its route. Permanent bivouacs were improved, so future groups could survive similar delays. Researchers were forced to remain underground longer, making flood isolation a known feature of the system rather than an unimaginable accident. Holach's water did not respond only to rain near the entrance. Runoff entered across a wide catchment above the cave, traveled through cracks and shafts, then appeared in lower passages after a delay. Conditions at the doorway could look manageable while water was still moving toward a constriction kilometers inside. Updates eventually confirmed the group's condition to teams outside, but communication alone could not reopen the flooded route. Despite the changing conditions, the expedition began. On Saturday morning, the 7 customers followed their certified guide through the entrance. They wore helmets, headlamps, rubber boots, and protective clothing. Each carried personal equipment and supplies for the planned overnight stay. The route would take them nearly 3 kilometers into the mountain to a permanent underground camp known as the Dom Bivouac. The journey was not a tourist walk. The men crossed uneven galleries, climbed through narrow sections, and descended approximately 300 meters below the surface. Progress required hours of physical effort. Once they entered the deeper system, turning around would take almost as long as continuing toward the bivouac. The Dom Bivouac had been built in a large chamber, specifically because flooding had trapped people in Holach before. It stood above known high water levels and contained insulated sleeping areas, cooking equipment, food reserves, and supplies for emergencies. The group reached the camp and spent Saturday night underground as planned. By Sunday morning, they were ready to begin the return journey. The route to the entrance was almost 3 kilometers long, but under normal conditions, it could be completed in several hours. Before they could leave, the guide checked the passage ahead. Water had risen through a low section of the route. One of the tunnels between the bivouac and the entrance had become a siphon. The ceiling descended close to the stream, and the rising water had filled the remaining airspace. Passing through would require entering a submerged passage with a current and no diving equipment. The guide stopped the group. They could not continue toward the entrance, and there was no simple second exit available to ordinary visitors. Holach contained alternative routes, but they involved deep shafts, technical climbing, and sections suitable only for specialist cave rescuers. The 8 men returned to the Dom Bivouac. Outside, the expedition organizers knew when the party was expected to emerge. When the guide reported the flooding and the group failed to return, Speleo Seeker Switzerland activated its Muatathal rescue unit. The first rescuers did not use the flooded tourist route. 4 specialists entered through another part of the system and began a demanding descent toward the bivouac. They traveled through wet shafts and technical passage, losing roughly 300 meters of elevation underground. It took them about 8 hours to reach the trapped group. All 8 men were uninjured. The chamber remained dry, the temperature held near 6 degrees Celsius, and the bivouac contained enough food and equipment to support them. The immediate situation was controlled, but the rescuers could not simply lead them back along the route they had used. That alternative required skills and equipment the customers did not possess. Forcing 7 amateur cavers through it would exchange a stable delay for a dangerous extraction. The only safe solution was to wait for the water to fall. Rain continued above the mountain. Runoff traveled through the limestone and kept feeding the cave. The water level at the blocked passage remained too high for an exit, and forecasts suggested that conditions might not improve for several days. The stranded men settled into the bivouac. The chamber had enough room for them to move around. They slept on insulated platforms, prepared meals, drank hot liquids, and used cards to pass the time. The food plan was extended through the weekend in case the flood lasted longer than expected. Although they were safe from the water, they were cut off beneath hundreds of meters of rock. There was no mobile telephone signal through the mountain. Rescuers established limited communication and carried messages and supplies through the technical route. As Monday passed, the water did not drop enough. The group had entered expecting to emerge on Sunday. Instead, they remained at the camp while rescue leaders measured rainfall, monitored gauges, and calculated how quickly water from the surface would reach the passages below. Leaving too early posed the greatest danger. Even a partial air gap above the stream could close again while the group was inside the low section. A sudden surge could pin someone against the ceiling or separate the party in moving water. The guide and rescue leaders therefore refused to gamble on a temporary improvement. On Tuesday, the rain continued. Additional rescuers transported food and equipment to the bivouac. The men remained in good spirits, but the operation had become an exercise in patience. No drilling, pumping, or rapid technical rescue could remove the water controlling the exit. By Wednesday, officials warned that the group might remain underground until Saturday. The trapped men prepared themselves for nearly a week in the cave. Their physical safety depended on the bivouac. Without its dry sleeping areas and stored supplies, 5 days at 6 degrees could have produced hypothermia, exhaustion, and a much more urgent rescue. Instead, the emergency shelter allowed the group to wait, without attempting a dangerous escape. Rescue leaders continued checking the cave streams and the weather above. On Thursday, the readings began improving earlier than expected. The rain weakened, and water at the siphons slowly receded. A possible exit window appeared. The opening was still narrow. At the lowest point, only about 40 centimeters separated the water from the ceiling. Anyone passing through would have to move carefully, while kneeling or crouching in cold water. The level also had to remain stable long enough for the entire group and its escorts to cross. Specialists inspected the route and confirmed that it was passable. That evening, after 5 days at the bivouac, the 8 men packed their equipment and began the journey out. Rescue personnel positioned themselves along the route and monitored the water behind them. The group left the Dom bivouac and entered the passages leading toward the siphon. In sections, water reached their knees. They moved one at a time through the lowest area, keeping their heads within the narrow airspace beneath the rock. Once the last person crossed, the greatest obstacle lay behind them. The remaining route still covered almost 3 kilometers. The men had spent several days underground and now had to climb through wet galleries toward the entrance. Rescuers guided the pace and watched for exhaustion. The exit journey took approximately 2.5 hours. Late on Thursday night, January 25th, the group reached the entrance. Shortly before midnight, all 7 customers and their guide emerged from Holok without injury. After medical checks, hot showers, and food, they were allowed to return home. The expedition had been intended to last 2 days. It lasted almost 6. The guide had not led the group into an unprepared refuge. The bivouac, stored provisions, and rescue procedures prevented the flooding from becoming a fight for survival. He also made the correct decision not to force the customers through rising water. Once the siphon filled, experience could no longer open it. 7 customers and their guide could do nothing except remain 3 kilometers inside the mountain until the cave decided to release them. On July 31st, 1999, 27-year-old Sharon Wright left Valley Vista Christian Camp with 6 young people and drove toward Bowden Cave in West Virginia. The youngest member of the group was 10. The oldest was 19. Wright was not taking them on a short walk near the entrance. Her plan was to enter through Bowden Cave's main entrance, travel more than a mile underground, and emerge through the upper Bear Heaven entrance. The route required hours of movement through dark passage, including hundreds of feet inside an active stream. At the far end, the group would have to climb a 20-foot pit to reach the exit. Wright expected an old handline to be hanging there. She had not gone to the Bear Heaven entrance before the trip to confirm that the rope was still in place. That single assumption would determine whether 7 people could leave the cave. The group reached the main entrance at about 3 in the afternoon. They carried flashlights and more hard hats. Food and water were packed together in one communal bag. Their clothing consisted largely of jeans and t-shirts, ordinary camp clothes that offered little insulation once wet. Bowden Cave was not completely unfamiliar to them. Wright and the campers had entered it earlier that week for a shorter trip. They also had a map and some information about the longer route. But none of those preparations solved the most important problem. The planned exit depended on equipment that no one in the group had brought and that Wright had not verified. This was also not Wright's first emergency inside Bowden Cave. Years earlier, she had become lost in the cave's maze section and required rescue. During the previous summer, the camp had used experienced cavers to help lead underground trips. On this occasion, Wright took responsibility for the route herself. Once the seven entered, daylight disappeared behind them. Their flashlights became the only reliable way to see the passage, obstacles, water, and map. Every hour underground reduced the batteries available for the return. The group continued away from the main entrance. Moving through more than a mile of natural cave passage was slow and strenuous. Uneven rock demanded careful footing. Low sections restricted movement. The stream route forced the campers to wade for hundreds of feet, soaking their shoes and clothing. Jeans absorb water quickly and dry slowly. As the group progressed, wet fabric remained against their bodies while the cave's colder air pulled heat from them. The younger campers were especially vulnerable, but turning back also became more difficult with every section they completed. Wright continued toward Bear Heaven. The route was designed as a through trip. Instead of retracing the entire journey, the group intended to reach the pit beneath the second entrance and climb directly out. That plan made the handline essential. A 20-foot vertical obstacle is far beyond a normal scramble for children wearing wet clothes after hours of caving. Without a secured rope, the campers could not safely climb it. The group kept moving because Wright believed the line would be waiting. Hours passed underground. The camp above continued through the evening while the seven remained beyond contact. There were no mobile telephones that could work through the surrounding rock, and no member of the party could report their progress. Outside, the camp could only wait for them to return. Eventually, Wright and the 6 campers reached the bottom of the 20-foot pit, leading upward to the Bear Heaven entrance. The handline was gone. At some point before their arrival, someone had removed the old rope. The report does not identify who removed it or when. What mattered was that Wright's entire exit plan ended at a bare vertical climb. The group stood more than a mile from the entrance through which they had started. They were already tired from several hours of strenuous travel. Their jeans, shirts, socks, and shoes were wet from the stream passage. Above them was the intended way out, but they had no rope, climbing system, or other safety equipment capable of lifting 6 campers up the pit. The missing handline left only 2 realistic choices. They could attempt the 20-foot climb without protection, risking a fall onto the people below, or reverse the complete route to the main entrance. The first option was unsafe. The second required enough working light to navigate another mile of cave, including the stream passage and every junction they had already crossed. They did not have enough battery power. Wright had brought flashlights, but not enough replacement batteries to guarantee a full retreat after the exit failed. Continuing to use the lights while attempting the return could leave the group in complete darkness somewhere inside the system. A cave map becomes useless when no one can see it. Progress through flowing water, uneven floors, and branching passage would become nearly impossible. Wright decided not to risk the climb or the long retreat. The 7 sat down at the bottom of the pit and waited. They could not conserve every light indefinitely. Some illumination was necessary to organize the group, check the campers, use the food and water, and watch the pit for rescuers. Yet each minute of light consumed more of the limited power that had prevented their retreat. The batteries were now emergency supplies rather than tools for escape. There was no immediate way to tell anyone where they were. Their safety now depended on someone outside recognizing that they were overdue, finding their vehicles at the cave, contacting emergency services, and searching the correct route before exposure became serious. As the waiting continued, the group's physical condition worsened. Wet clothing steadily carried heat away from their bodies. Remaining still reduced the heat produced by movement. Several of the younger campers became very cold. Food and water were available from the communal pack, but the group had not brought equipment for an unplanned night underground. There were no dry clothes mentioned in the accident report, no sleeping bags, and no independent climbing system to solve the obstacle above them. Darkness itself was not the greatest immediate danger. The cold was. Hypothermia can begin before a person recognizes how impaired they have become. Shivering consumes energy. Hands lose coordination. Clear decisions become harder. For children who were already wet and exhausted, every additional hour increased the seriousness of the situation. At Valley Vista Christian Camp, 9 o'clock arrived without the group. The camp director did not know that the missing handline had stopped them. He only knew that Wright and 6 campers had failed to return. He drove to Bowden Cave and found their cars still parked at the entrance. He called for help. Emergency personnel began organizing a search. Bowden Cave had multiple entrances and more than one possible route, so rescuers sent teams underground from different points. They did not have direct communication with the stranded party, but the planned destination gave them a likely area to check. Inside, Wright and the campers continued waiting beneath the pit. They had now been underground far beyond the length of an ordinary camp excursion. The younger members remained wet and increasingly cold, but the group stayed together rather than attempting a desperate, unprotected climb. Search parties moved through the cave from each entrance. One team eventually reached the stranded group at the bottom of the Bear Heaven pit. Finding them ended the uncertainty, but it did not remove the obstacle. The campers still had to be raised 20 feet to the exit. This time, trained rescuers brought the equipment that the original group lacked. They rigged a hauling system above the pit. One by one, the campers were secured and pulled upward. Wright was also brought out. The evacuation continued through the night as rescuers worked at the narrow underground exit. By 6:30 on the morning of August 1st, all 7 people were outside. No one had suffered a major injury, but several of the younger campers were extremely cold when they emerged. Their ordeal had lasted through the night because the leader had trusted an old handline without checking whether it existed and had carried too little battery power to retreat when it did not. The missing rope did not unexpectedly fail while someone climbed it. It was absent before the trip began. A simple inspection of the Bear Heaven entrance would have revealed that the planned exit could not be used. Carrying a rope would have removed the dependency. Additional batteries would have preserved the option of returning through the cave. Instead, 6 young people followed an adult leader for more than a mile into a wet cave and arrived at an exit that existed only in the plan. Once they reached the pit, there was no safe way forward and not enough light for the route behind them. Their only remaining option was to sit in wet clothes beneath 20 feet of rock and wait for someone outside to realize that the guide's plan had failed.